Ladies and gentlemen, welcome tonight to the Stafford Lions Club for the forum, the Stafford Forum on asset sales. With us tonight we have Professor John Quiggin from the University of Queensland, who has written a number of papers in recent years examining the economic benefits and or otherwise of privatisation. We have Dr Anthony Lynham, the Labor candidate, and Boccabella, the Greens candidate. I'm not going to go into lengthy biographies. You look them up on the web, I'm sure that you will get plenty in your mailboxes. The procedure for tonight will be I'll open up with Professor Quiggin, who will speak for about 10 minutes on his view of privatisation, particularly as it relates to the electricity sector. I'll then throw the other two candidates, and apologies from the LNP, and we haven't heard from Family First. And then open it to you guys, because it's your forum, not the candidates, and we'd like to hear from you guys as much as possible. But right now I'll hand you over to Professor Quiggin.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Well, I've been working on this issue in one form or another for 20 plus years, so I've seen lots of different arguments for asset sales. I want to emphasise I don't have a preconceived view that asset sales are always good or always bad. There are cases when they're justified and cases when they're not. Unfortunately, the majority of cases in Australia have been backed by a spurious kind of case which typically runs along the following line. First, a spurious financial emergency that the government is alleged to be facing is claimed to necessitate asset sales. It's also promised, though, that the proceeds from the asset sales can be spent on good things we would like hospitals and schools. So what I want to say is that a case of that kind is always spurious. There's no way that selling an asset, an income-generating asset, will yield significant additional capacity for public spending or significantly improve the government's financial position. Any more than if you're in debt and you sell your house and rent it back again, you're significantly financially better off. The issues on whether we should or shouldn't sell assets, the serious issues concern how the assets are best managed, whether they best belong in the private sector, as many assets do, or in the public sector. Of course, those questions haven't been addressed in the slightest in this campaign. They weren't addressed in the slightest in the previous asset sales campaign undertaken by the previous government, which also made use of the same entirely spurious arguments. So we haven't seen any kind of case for privatisation. And the evidence looking at the electricity industry, which I've also worked on for the past 20 years, is that the idea of privatisation is part of a failed program of reform, a program which was promised to yield competition, more choice, better quality, lower prices. Well, I think all of us know how that campaign has turned out. Now, I wrote a lengthy report for, in fact, the Victorian branch of the ETU describing that process. The case for privatisation essentially rests on the idea that it hasn't worked so far, we just need more of the same, and finally we'll get there and get these really good outcomes. Finally, I guess, the government's actual proposal in relation to the electricity sector, in particular in relation to electricity distribution, it's kind of complicated, and I think it's fair to say it's a Clayton's asset sale. That is, whereas previous other governments in, for example, Victoria and South Australia had actually sold the distribution system to a private company which then controlled it, and which, particularly in the case of South Australia, led to some of the highest electricity prices in the entire world. This is a proposal which attempts to get the debt off the government's books without really transferring any risk or ownership to the private sector. So it's essentially, at least in the short run, a cosmetic procedure which will make the government's books look better, make it be able to claim reduced debt, but won't actually reduce any of the real economic facts, change any of the economic facts on the ground. It is, however, a potential Trojan horse that once we have this pseudo equity out there, it can be used as a justification for going the whole hog at some later point. Because, and I've been through this process many times, what we see is a kind of salami slicing tactic where a government says, we're not really going to privatise, we're going to do this half measure, and I come and say these half measures are really stupid. You should either sell the whole asset or sell nothing, and they say Professor Quiggin doesn't know what he's talking about. Then, once the partial sale has gone through, they say, This half measure is hopeless, can't stand, we have to sell the entire asset. And that was the case with the sale of the Commonwealth Bank 25 years ago. It's been the case, that was the case with Telstra, it's been the case many times since. The result of this procedure is the public gets less money for their assets than if we'd sold the asset straight out first time. No additional benefits or controls. Any so-called safeguards are put in place, inevitably removed. And we're seeing that with Qantas right now, where the safeguard of Australian ownership is about to be scrapped because it never made sense in any case. What we get therefore is this third-rate procedure. So if the government was serious about privatisation, it would be finding a foreign company, selling the assets whole as follows to that company, getting the full price and getting the expertise of that. Instead, what we're seeing is just a shabby accounting manoeuvre that achieves nothing. Now that's my summary of those points. There's lots of issues around. I'll be happy to take some questions once the candidates have had their say, and you may be more interested, I guess, in what they have to say on the subject than what I do. Thank you.
Thanks for that, John. Look, I'd now like to introduce Dr. Anthony Lynham, who will just give his summary in the course of 2 or 3 very short minutes for an aspiring politician.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. And just to point out, imagine if we did still have the Commonwealth Bank in public ownership, how many billions of dollars we see that thing making profit, and how our budget would be so much better off if we still had that asset. Look, I'd also just like to remind you all that there's been 4 community forums, and Anne and I have been to all 4 community forums. And we are listening to the people of Stafford, unlike others. We are here, this issue affects us all. It affects us as individuals, it affects us as families, but it affects our entire community, our state. It is that important. And selling off these hard-earned assets that our mum and dads got for us, our grandparents got for us, is just plain wrong. It is wrong. Now, Campbell Newman always hammers the battlers, takes off what we've done for the state, and rewards his big business. Always. Off the battlers to big business. It's just the wrong way. Socially, community, it's wrong. They'll do nothing. These asset sales will do nothing to lower your electricity bill. Absolutely nothing. Like in South Australia, John, the electricity went through the roof. They'll do nothing to lower unemployment. And they'll do nothing to help those who are already suffering from Newman and Abbott's cuts. They rob our state of much needed revenue. Revenue to build our future. Future schools, future hospitals. It's all gone. Like, where's it going to come from without using our assets? Look, only Labor stands with the people of Queensland to stop asset sales. Only Labor. We have already committed to putting into place a long-term asset retention plan. We do not need to sell these assets, and we can still balance the budget easily, but over a longer period of time, gently and carefully. We will focus on paying down general government debt while ensuring that government-owned businesses are run efficiently and profitably, and the electricity industry is run efficiently and profitably. The LNP simply, again, do not want to listen. They have ideology that says we have to sell assets. And for what reason? Just because of pure ideology. There is no other reason. So the choice is clear. LNP, assets sold. Labor, assets stay with us. A lot of people in this community did not want a by-election, but thank God we've got it, because now we can send Newman and his LNP the clearest message of them all. Thank you.
Greens candidate in Stafford. Or over to you.
Thanks, folks, and thank you for coming along this evening. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous people on whose land we're meeting and their elders past and present. And Anthony, it's not only the Commonwealth Bank, it's the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory. Shares sold by us for $3.50. Recently those shares were worth $80.50 each. What have we lost? Hundreds and hundreds of pathology records that are untouchable in the world. That was a great resource. Back to the forum. The forum tonight's been called to highlight the threat of the $33 billion of Queensland asset sales going ahead, despite large-scale community consultation that showed clearly it was not supported by the Queensland public. So if you want to see something flagrant, John, that was it. This is not a new phenomenon. Unfortunately, as the ALP did sell $15 billion worth of our assets in their last term of government without a mandate and against strong outcries against this policy. It's quite clear from analysis of privatisation in Australia and abroad that the yield from public ownership is equal or greater than the option of selling assets, particularly when the revenue raised is merely used to repay debt. I'd like to quote the LNP's latest document, strongest, smartest, choicest document. Have you all read it? There is a section in there that says, intuitively I felt, where the proceeds from the sale or lease from a government business is reinvested in productive infrastructure that drives economic growth, the government will benefit from increased revenues, e.g. payroll and royalties. And I fell over laughing at royalties. The government may also invest in the next generation of economic infrastructure that can generate future revenue. Clearly the government's not following that advice because Tim Nichols says that they're nearly paying off debt, and he has obviously no intention of investing in the next generation of anything unless coal seam gas meets that description, and he seems to think it does because that's what he told me recently at a Chamber of Commerce meeting. The future of Queensland is coal seam gas, and that certainly doesn't meet that definition of next generation of economic infrastructure, or I hope it doesn't, because I can tell you it's so damaging to our main resources of food and water in this state. We can't even think about going for it. And it's absolutely fallacious to claim that a private provider will maintain the infrastructure or retain the number of employees while returning a profit to their investors and meeting repayments of possible debt that they've incurred in purchasing the state business. Because they didn't all have it in their back pocket, you know, they had to borrow the money. The dishonesty in the claims by the LNP that there will be a hearty profit for the government after the private companies take their share from the lease or joint ownership, again as John called it, the Clayton scheme, is ludicrous. It's not going to be there. The government says we'll still get a stream of revenue when we've done this, you know, 49 for me and 51 for them, or whatever they think they're going to do with Q-Rail or the electricity. Their failure to understand, for example, the role of 11,000 employees of the electricity generation and supply industry in re-establishing services after an extreme weather event is evident. It's evident they do not appreciate the importance of having these people distributed within communities the length and breadth of this huge state and what they bring to those communities. Privatisation always results in fewer jobs, so you could see 5, 6, 7,000 based on the South Australian model disappearing out of the system, and far less maintenance done on assets that are so important at the moment. So when we have something like Cyclone Yasi, Brisbane floods and inland tsunami, we won't have those workers there in those local communities ready to roll. We won't have any of the schemes that were put in place then to reduce costs to people who are really hard hit, because a private company won't do that. It simply won't have the heart or care for the people. So while the Greens welcome Labor's opposition to this latest round of privatisation, I'm not sure we can trust them not to do the same thing. Sorry, Anthony. And if they end up back in government. Only the Greens do have a consistent record on privatisation, and only the Greens can be trusted consistently to oppose it. It is sadly ironic that this LNP and previous Labor government's bottom lines are so heavily affected by natural disaster. And that was quite clear because Anna did sell off Q-Rail, specifically to pay off Yasi. And as we're being told, we're being paying off debt from the cyclones and so forth now. Yet neither really are doing anything to address climate change and other environmental threats, and these are after all what's causing these huge events. And Not4Sale is of no benefit in dealing with a structural budget deficit. Privatisation is short thinking and it produces no economic solution. I think that probably rests my case. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. I'd just like, as devil's advocate, to raise a couple of points on the panel before I throw it open to the audience. And Anthony, you said that only Labor stands in the way of privatisation. This wasn't the case a few years ago, certainly after the 2009 election, when Labor was prosecuting the case for selling state assets that were described as capital hungry and better off the books than on them. What has changed in the last few years?
That's very easy. We learned a big lesson. We learned a huge lesson. But I'm being richly rewarded with these fine people standing beside me. But my God, I hate to see these people standing against me. Labor learnt a hard lesson, and it's not in our policy, and Labor's not going to repeat that mistake.
What I'd like to hear perhaps then from Anne is, given the arguments espoused by the current government in relation to actually restructuring the balance sheet, how would you go about addressing what even Labor conceded in its last couple of budgets was a fairly unsustainable budget trajectory which does need some addressing?
I probably want to look at some of the better practices I'm seeing around the world, where countries are actually engaging in renewable and sustainable industry. I'd like to see massive renewable source of power as well that these electricity companies are not even envisaging, and that's what's threatening the jobs as well, because ultimately coal probably will go. Not probably will go, it will go. And we still have to keep the jobs, and we still have to keep that source of power. And we need enormous, I think, power for new industrial ideas. I do know that in Townsville, a year and a half ago, one of our members up there suggested to the local major industries up there a way of actually powering a massive manufacturing area that would have gone straight through the port of Townsville. They loved it. They put together a $2 million concept to Anna Bligh. Her response, "Oh, we're going to get gas from Bikini, don't worry about it." So we lost that potential of this massive area up there that would have provided thousands and thousands of jobs through renewable energy. Things like solar thermal take 7,000 people per plant. It's a robotic industry. All of the robotic workers from the motorworks could easily go into that with almost no training. Not that they necessarily want to go there, but it is an opportunity for them. There are so many opportunities in new industries, and that's what the fund that we helped set up with Labor last time, the Clean Energy Fund, was to do that. $10 billion was to seed fund all of these new industries. That's where your revenue has to come from, not old coal. And I mean, Newman's on record saying if you don't have coal, you don't have schools, hospitals, policing or anything. I don't believe that. But I also hear from Labor that they can only see coal seam gas as an alternative to get us out of the short-term misery we're in at the moment, they say. I don't think we're in the same budgetary hole that they're talking about. I believe it's a furphy. I believe it's just one of those things to push us into doing things we really shouldn't be doing. And we're making really no effort in current governments to think of the future. No TAFEs, no jobs, no young people with apprenticeships. Seriously, without this sort of industry, how do you even get the apprenticeships? I've had apprentices because I've got a building company and a plumbing company. How do you pay them? How do you do anything with them? Because there's no support in this government at the moment. So I think we need to look to the future, to tomorrow, get the jobs out of tomorrow, not yesterday.
Thanks, Anne. Look, one to John before I throw it open to the floor. John, you mentioned a couple of examples of, perhaps questionable privatisation, one of them being the Commonwealth Bank. But do you see a difference between privatising natural monopolies and companies or assets that maybe, such as in the power generating sector in the 21st century, open to all manner of competition and arguably an area that the government would be better off not wearing that sort of risk?
Well, first, as regards the Commonwealth Bank, I mean, the real problem wasn't so much the sale, because it was an industry that met those criteria largely, as the fact that it was sold for a drastically low price, which, and I did the analysis at the time, pointing out that the public was, the public as a whole was getting ripped off. Of course, people who took up the shares did very, very nicely. So I think that was more an issue of underpricing than a particularly bad privatisation in that sense. I guess I remain sceptical of the case for selling electricity generation assets and indeed the whole competitive model. I think the problem really is that the market reform model as a whole has failed, and until we fix that, I don't think we should be looking at further asset sales.
Right, sorry, we don't have a roving mic tonight, so you may have to speak up, but I'd like to open it up to the floor. Just the only proviso being, keep it polite. We're here to learn. So please, who's got an issue that may like to raise? Sir.
Yeah, Tom Brown from the Rail Tram and Bus Union. I'd like to ask both the candidates a question, the same or a similar question. Start with Anne. And what future do you envisage for public transport in Brisbane if the Greens go towards government policy?
Thank you. Not only the Greens, but also my father was a foundation member of the Australian Institute of Transport, and I think he'd rise to the grade if I didn't keep it in public ownership. It is being privatised by deceit. You're getting depots sold off. The Bowen Hills depot is going to be sold, and they've moved into a state government building that they're renting, but who knows what will happen. Willawong's been sold. We've lost so many depots. I think we only own 3 out of the 7 that we had. They're selling off, the state government is owning the buses, most of them now. The new ones have all got state government logos on them, so they can sell them very easily. The Brisbane City Council owns very little. It's got its 2,000 workers and a handful of old gas buses, which, because no one else around Australia seems to have the facility to power them, is worth almost nothing in resale. So you are seeing, by stealth, the loss of the public transport of Brisbane, the buses. I also think we need to add to the buses, and I'm a great tram lover, so there you go, I'd like to see some trams back on. But as far as the Brisbane City Council buses, which I think is what you're referring to me, I see the loss of services. I see almost what they did in Los Angeles in the 1930s. They had a very viable bus system. Along came the car manufacturers, they bought up the bus system. They made sure it absolutely wasn't viable. They stretched out the services, made everything absolutely impossible for anyone to use it, and suddenly we discovered cars. What a wonderful idea. So we'd all pay for billions of dollars worth of roads, disability, poor, whatever, had no means of movement, and everyone had to own a car. And that's what we're doing in the city at the moment, I think. Once you privatise bus services, once you allow contracts to be done in the private way as the buses outside of Brisbane, they only have to comply with those terms in the last 4 to 5 months of a 4-year contract. So you can get absolute crap for 3.5 years in the last 4 or 5 months. You might actually get a frequency of service within that 500 metres of your home. You need to keep public ownership of all means of transport in this city and in this state, and I strongly defend it, and the Greens do too. We would never allow it to be sold. And put us in there so we can do something for you.
Thanks, Sam. I'll hand you over.
Can I just rephrase the question, because Labor can form government, and so what future for Brisbane buses under a Labor government?
Thanks, Tom. The future is public ownership, there's no doubt about that. Public ownership, the best thing about public ownership is that every 3 years people get to have a say on how that bus service is going. If private ownership, that's immediately taken away from you. The avenue of complaints to a private company are not as strong as to a public company which is owned by yourself. Now, one can see what's happening with this government. You know, I haven't seen a busway extension since Newman came in. Most of the work on the busway seems to have just stopped. I've also seen in Stafford services like 379 to 353, they're becoming more and more less frequent. They're not reliable. People can't just hop on a bus every hour because mostly it just doesn't come anymore. We're seeing services being cut all the time. We're seeing the council, once proud public bus service, being flitted away. And that was a public utility that was well run, it was efficient, and the people of Brisbane were proud to own their bus service. And I think with John, this is the mechanism of a government. You know, run it down, becomes very unprofitable, the complaints come in from the community, we'll just sell it off. Only to get a very short-term hit in revenue, and for us to see a service that is not a smidgen on what we once had, and also a service where we can't complain about it. We just have to take what we get. There's no way or means of complaining against these private companies. So Labor wants to keep public transport, and it wants not only to keep public transport, but you've seen what Labor's done. Labor builds on public transport.
Thanks, Anthony. Could I have someone else on the floor, please? Sir.
Yeah, Daniel Loney, work for Energy. Ian talked previously about the massive job cuts to frontline staff in the Victorian, South Australian privatisation. I just wanted to ask Professor John Quiggin about what sort of money or the increases in money we could see through duplication under the current proposal in board members and executive members.
Sure. Yeah. So what my research suggested was there was big cuts in frontline staff, but these have been largely offset by increases in managerial and marketing staff. So there's less people actually fixing the wires, more people trying to persuade you to switch companies, to supervise those people. People, of course, paid to fire people, and people paid to supervise those people, and so forth. So the end result has been that we've seen a substantial diminution in the number of technical staff in the. This is the data for the whole of the utility sector, which has been subject to this process of privatisation and corporatisation, but a substantial expansion, particularly in senior managerial staff, both numbers, pay. The more highly paid you are, of course, the more assistants and support staff that you need to help you to use that salary more effectively, I guess. So the end result has been less jobs for the people who actually deliver the services, and more jobs for the people who deliver the services.
Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah.
Yep. And someone else, please. Maybe from this side? Or at the back. Yes, sir.
I'm David Simpson, and I was happy to ask some questions of Bob Anderson.
Sorry about that.
What I've heard is each year you ask them the same questions that I was going to ask, and that is that they've got projections in these documents for what they call fiscal repair, which was carried out last year. But they've got absolutely no projections for after asset sales. And it strikes me as really stupid. So I would urge everyone to ask Tim Nichols and Bob Anderson for the projections for the budget. And they have got projections here up to 2022. So we need projections after asset sales.
2022 is a pretty good projection, but I might just let Professor Quiggin have a chop at this one.
Yeah, well, of course, the budget projections reflect all the income and revenue of the general government sector. So what you expect when you sell assets is that, assuming they're used to repay debt, of course we've heard that the same dollar is going to be used to repay a dollar of debt, which is great, to invest in some new income-generating infrastructure, which is great again, and to buy you a school or hospital, which is great again. And I guess if I had a device for turning $1 into 3, I'd be turning it over pretty fast. But I think to give them some kind of credit, we can assume they're going to use it to repay debt, If so, the government saved money because it spends less on interest, and they've made a big noise about how much that is.
Yeah, but we get ripped off, the little blokes. Little blokes getting ripped off all the time.
They do. They lose the flow of income from the asset. Roughly speaking, those two things cancel out, and that's why there's nothing in the budget, because there's no benefit to show. And of course, we have the experience of the past of asset sales. The government is, on the one hand, saying asset sales are vital, but you don't hear them praising the $15 billion of asset sales we saw, because they, of course, had no impact at all on the government's fiscal position.
Would Andrew or Anne like to have, sorry, do either of you have anything to say in terms of longer-term fiscal impact of asset sales, in terms of this whole budgetary repair argument?
Just one thing. I'm probably going in a backward step on that, but I can say that in many instances, prior to selling these assets, we pumped billions of dollars into getting them ready for sale. So with the sale under Labor, there was 4.6 billion returned on Q-Rail, 3 billion spent getting it ready for sale. And I'm seeing that also with the power industry at the moment, a lot of money being pumped into the big coal-fired power stations to get them up to speed, because I know that a lot of people were taken out of them. At one stage, I think 200 workers were taken out of the one, name which escapes me, up near Harvey Bay. Thank you. And that was working pretty lean for a long time. So they spent an awful lot of money. So I'd like to also see the bottom line of what we really get out of something when we've got it ready for sale, and then pretend we're going to make an income from it. But I don't think we are going to get an income, because Campbell's already said the only chance you have to build schools and whatever is for coal. So I don't think he's really looking for profits from asset sales. I just don't think he'd run a dummy.
I think there's a question over here. Sir.
I'm Bruce Corkill. I'm a member of the Services Union, and I'm a Greens voter. And in general, I'd like to make the point that I think the left is too reactive these days and not proactive enough. And I'd like to hear what the two parties' president's opinion is on, if these assets were to be sold, should we renationalise them? Is that something that you guys would advocate for? Because once they're gone unless we renationalise them. So.
Okay. Interesting question, renationalisation or starting to build again. What's your turn to start this one, Anthony?
Unfortunately, what people might believe, the ALP, we're not into nationalising anything, and haven't been for many, many years. Even Heady days at Gough with them, you remember that there was a push to try to nationalise things under Gough, but he refused as well. And it hasn't been on the Labor Party's agenda at all. I think the only way of doing it is to prevent rather than cure. I think the fight's here, the line in the sand is right now, and now we stand our ground, because once it's sold, to renationalise has a lot of implications, especially how our economy is perceived by overseas investors as well. So it has just too many implications that just do not work for the health of the Australian economy if we start nationalising. The line in the sand is now. We must act. But I was just going on that, Campbell Union is going to get back 25 billion in asset sales. The Labor Party left was, I think, it was 62 billion. The debt's now up to 85. So 25 billion onto 85. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And then we lose all the revenue that we would have got from our institutions. It just, I think that one of the best ploy, or the best way we can teach or educate the people of Queensland is give them a simple sheet and a $5 calculator and say, guys, work it out for yourself. It's pretty easy to work out, it makes no sense at all.
Prevent rather than cure, spoken like a true doctor. I'll just turn over my hand, but John wants a word too on this one.
I don't know about nationalising, but I do know that in Victoria, when they sold off the trams and they sold off Country Rail, they had so poor maintenance that they ended up buying them back, and they have done that. You can do that. It is within the realm of government to buy these things back, because Victoria has. They sold off their inner schools, for God's sake, and that's what the LNP's been doing. They've had to reopen them. There is no option in many cases. You cannot have rail derailed, trams falling off tracks and stopping working in the middle of a busy day and leave it with the private companies. These companies actually went broke. There was no option. So I think you'll find that if you privatise many things, that you will end up getting them back, possibly at a cheap rate. A bit like Mr. Packer, who sells television stations, watches them collapse and then buys them back for nothing. So maybe that's what we can do. But that certainly has been the evidence in Australia that we have bought back these public utilities that are being sold off. And I think that's feasible, and that certainly would be the Greens policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. John Quiggin, maybe on how we ensure that service delivery, if we privatise something, is actually delivered, and what the options are if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, first, as I want to say, my belief is we should be looking at renationalisation. I think we would have been far better off, for example, renationalising Telstra. They're attempting to duplicate it with the NBN. Of course, we would have been far better off not selling it in the first place. And in fact, as far back as 2000, or just before 2000, time of the internet boom, I was suggesting that we could sell off the internet part of Telstra, the Foxtel business, and use the proceeds to buy back the part of Telstra which we'd sold. It was at that time only partially sold. I think the view, quite frankly, of foreign investors has been entirely discredited by the global financial crisis. I don't think the idea that international financial markets have a lot to offer us in terms of their perceptions is a sound one. I think therefore that we should be looking in particular at renationalisation of the electricity grid. My view would be, and I don't know why this is going to create difficulties, that we should be looking at a national ownership rather than continuing with state ownership of a mixture of state and private ownership that we have at present. So my first point is I think that in these natural monopoly sectors in particular, we should be proceeding towards renationalisation, preferably at a national level. That's obviously not on the political agenda right at the moment, but I think the failure of electricity reform, the failure of telecommunications reform eventually will necessitate this. And we have seen, and mentioned some relatively minor instances, but there have also been some substantial instances in the UK, for example, where the London Underground was partially privatised and then renationalised. The rail system was fully privatised and then effectively renationalised. So I think that is a serious option. Obviously, the pressure for that increases in cases where not only has there been a financial failure, but also a service delivery failure, and that was very much the case with the UK rail instances. I think it's also been the case very clearly with privatisation in the electricity sector.
Thanks, John. I have another question. Was one on this slide I missed earlier? No? And yes, ma'am.
I would just like to, one of the things that I've heard about privatisations is it actually privatises profit and it makes public the debt that's left behind in this sort of situation. One of the things that greatly concerns me about this privatisation that nobody has mentioned, and I know electricity is very important, but also the Sun Water that's proposed for sale in northern Queensland, which I've heard very little about. And personally, I believe that we should never, ever have in public hands what is a necessity for life. And I would put water and power in that because they affect our quality of life. And I'd just like to hear from the members of the panel of what they feel about that particular.
Sun Water is not one I'm particularly familiar with, and so I'm going to hand this hospital pass to Anthony.
Now, the first point is very, very valid about how we, as the public, built up this business, took all the risk, created a monopoly, and then selling off an ironclad asset, a get-rich-quick scheme to whoever buys the darn thing. Why don't the companies take all the risk? You know, if we do need something new, a new big piece of infrastructure, John, a new power station or something like that, why should the public take the risk? Why not let the companies take all the risk of building something like that, rather than giving them what we already have built up ourselves? Let them have all the problems. Why give them all? But with some water, there are some pieces of infrastructure that are absolutely sacrosanct. You know, our water supply, for God's sake. I mean, how desperate do we have to be as a community to give away water supply? How desperate? You know, water supply, our waste management services, you know, things like that that every community needs and has to be safe. I mean, I was talking to cleaners the other day, hospital cleaners, which must meet absolutely strict criteria considering all the superbugs. I have to bring it back to a medical term. These are hospital cleaners that the government want to privatise out. And you can imagine the services we'll get from private cleaners compared to these well-trained, credible, absolutely wonderful staff that we have in our hospitals doing the cleaning for us. So things like that, hospital cleaning, water supply, sacrosanct, cannot be sold.
I think I said at the start, two big things was food security and water security. Now CSG is doing its damnedest to ruin the water security by getting into the aquifers and ruining the artesian basin. And that will take 10,000 years to repair if we allow it to go ahead. Sun Water has an asset value of $7 billion, and you can imagine how little that's going to be sold based on this small amount that we're going to get for our ports. Gladstone, billions have gone into it. We might get $500 million for that. So I can't see anywhere in the audit report how much they actually think Sun Water is worth, but it owns 7 dams, pumping stations, nearly all the drainage channels in Queensland. It has the rights to build 2 new approved dams, and can you imagine the environmental controls if this was privately owned? I mean, the Mary River was a debacle, that dam, didn't comply with anything, was never going to work, and even in the LNP this was that number 22 out of 25 options. But this is the sort of thing that we seem to be prepared to do. Water is absolutely vital in this state. We've got 5% of the land arable, and a lot of our water threatened because 60,000 farmers and local rural communities rely on the artesian basin. We're very cavalier with our water. We seem to think we can feed an ever-growing population on reduced amounts of land and no clean water. So I just cannot even encompass selling it. But there's no doubt that Sun Water is part of that $33 billion package that was approved by Cabinet as part of the audit report. So they approved the whole thing. No reservations to anything. There is absolutely no way a Green candidate could ever sell anything that vital to this state. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. I'm not sure where that $500 million figure comes from Gladstone Port. Is that what you're talking about?
It's out in the asset sales. That and the port up in Townsville are valued at about $1.8 billion. That's what the asset's saying. That's all they're going to get for it, for those two combined, and that's in the document.
John, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. On the water issue, it's been one of the least successful areas of privatisation. Even the Kennett government looked at water privatisation and backed off, and the South Australian privatisation was a debacle. What we've seen more of is partial privatisation, so-called public-private partnerships, and of course those were the scandals we're seeing in New South Wales emerge almost entirely from that water sector. Sorry. Yeah. So we've seen a history of failures in water privatisation. I think it's notable to observe that very quietly the water industry has restructured over the last 5 years or so, very much in line with the failed restructuring of electricity. In fact, looking at some of the documents as I did when it came out, you could just about see where electricity had been whited out and water typed in, even though they're very different commodities with very different properties. Somebody just decided that the electricity model was so wonderful that if only we had something similar in water, we would see the same marvellous benefits as we had from electricity reform.
Thanks, John. And from the floor, please, if there's anyone else. Yes, ma'am.
Marlene John Henson.
So, Marlene, is it?
Yes. What happens to the prices for power in the country if the assets are sold?
Who would you like to start
I
with?
was just asking.
John, yours.
Sure. Well, in principle, most of these things are subject to regulation, and so a lot of...
It'll go up again. That's
well, I think that's the most likely outcome, of course. I think it's fair to say that the whole while privatisation is the end point of the process, the whole process has been a failure, including corporatisation. I mean, Ergon and Energex didn't always exist. We once had Northweb and Sequeb, and those institutions had a public service mandate, whereas Ergon and Energex are government-owned corporations, aimed to be run more like the private sector. So the whole process has failed at every point for reasons I go through at length. So I expect in the long run, in the short run, I don't expect big changes because the regulatory setup is much the same under public or private ownership. What we see though is the moment we need new investment, the corporation has the regulator over a barrel. And I actually, for my sins, used to regulate the electricity industry at one time, and when we had the blackouts, we just had to sign on for increases in increasing cost to build more infrastructure, even though it was clear the blackouts were largely the fault of staff cuts that had been undertaken in the 1990s when Energex was assuring everybody that they could do the job with many less staff than they inherited from the previous statutory corporation. So I expect increases in the long run, but probably not much in the short run.
John, can you explain to me why electricity is going right through the roof?
Well, yeah, the guts of it, I mean, there's two problems. The core of it is really the combination of the fact that the market reforms work badly, which has meant we've needed to put more into distribution infrastructure than we really should because they got everything backwards, but also the rate of return on that infrastructure is calculated in a private sector formula. That's why, in fact, the assets are so much more valuable. They're calculated on a formula which gives a much higher rate of return than the government used to get when they financed these things by issuing debt. And so the core of it is that we're paying, it's like paying on your credit card versus paying on your home mortgage. We're just paying a lot more in regulated returns on those distribution assets. But it's also true the whole competitive model has failed, and so we're seeing...
We've had more rides than the sun.
Indeed.
It just keeps going up.
That's it.
I've read, and I'm happy if John wishes to comment, that we did about $48 billion worth of maintenance or upgrades to the poles and wires, $20 billion of which was probably unnecessary. So a lot of what you're paying now is serious errors in judgment by government. Also, because there's been a lot of failures of the user to pay, obviously it's gone up so much they can't, they've had to increase their administration. So you've got an element of administration you're paying for, a very high debt on the poles and wires upgrades, and very small amount of that damn carbon
But what's the
tax.
difference about going underground?
Oh, look, I would do that every time, but that's not what the government chose to do. They chose to put in more poles and wires, and that's where a lot of the debt comes from, I believe, but I can stand corrected on that.
So,
Chris Fitzpatrick.
Chris, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The previous question about the rural price of power is probably a moot point because hasn't Kim Newman taken away the uniform tariff policy as well, which balance out that fee?
That's not my understanding. In fact, and John might be able to correct me here, but one of the biggest single outlays outside of your health education spending and the budget with some of the community service obligations going to support that uniform tariff policy. John?
Yeah, my understanding is the same, that it's maintained. Of course, what you see, I think, again, is that this is a recipe for trouble once you have privatisation. We saw that with Telstra, that essentially Telstra inherited the community service obligation, it used that to blackmail the government continuously, and yeah, that's why why Telstra never rolled out the kind of broadband upgrades we needed, why we had to have the NBN, and why the NBN was so much more costly than we've maintained public ownership with a community service, with particularly with a statutory corporation structure, as opposed to the corporatised structure. The difference being that the statutory authority takes community service as the primary obligation, with the corporatised, either government-owned corporation or privatised firm. The companies there to make profits. The community service obligation is then bolted on top as something the taxpayer has to pay for, and that's a model which simply hasn't worked well.
Does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, I actually thought that I'd heard that hasn't got rid of it now, but he's actually planning to get rid of it in the next year or two. So probably a next.
I think that would be political suicide, but I'm not let
I think it's under review. It is under review as part of the independent review panel, as far as I'm aware, for 2015.
It's $600 million a year that Energex gives to Ergon to maintain that price. So if you own Energex, would you be very keen to give $600 million to your competitor?
Well, I think it'll come out of general revenue in future.
Yeah, so the government have to pay that rather than the company.
So that's a loss. Yeah, that's
I heard it. I'll just ask a question, John.
yeah.
I heard that a lot of our high power prices are due to a reliability index of sorts. That it was set at a reliability of very high levels, and therefore the poles and wires and everything need to pay for this higher reliability, and that reliability now has been dropped.
Yeah, so it's a complicated story, because it really goes in two parts. Then the first phase of reform, if we look at this claim of gold plating, it was applied both to the previous publicly owned system, and the claim was it was too reliable, had too many staff. So when we went to the combination of privatisation and corporatisation, large numbers of technical staff were sacked, expenditure was cut. Then we had breakdowns. We had, anybody who was here in Brisbane in 2001 remembers that. We had the Longford disaster in Victoria. We had a whole series of blackouts, and that then led to a counter-reaction where we saw this increase in investment. The other points that are relevant, I guess, are first that the cost of unreliability has increased with respect to computers, so the standard service people want has increased. But the second is, if you take the whole logic of this market reform seriously, it ought to have started with consumers, started with things like peak time of day pricing, the kind of things that are being talked about, but I think won't happen now because everybody is so disillusioned with the entire system that they, I think, correctly perceive that any change is bound to be a rip-off of some kind. But without those kinds of changes, without people being able to pay for quality of service, we end up going through this whipsaw process where we got these big reductions in quality. Then the regulations were tightened up, and again I was there in the front line trying to deal with things like call centres that couldn't answer people's questions, and still can't from my recollection of Yazzie, I must say. From the inability to service the network, we went to this counter-reaction. Of course, all the new investment was rewarded at this high commercial rate of return as opposed to the bond rate that we had used to finance the earlier investment.
Thanks, John. Into the floor again, sir.
Dr. Lyon, you talked about Labor's vision for the future, having efficiently run profitable GOCs servicing the network. Do you think the current status of the GOCs is efficient enough? Would you implement any suggested or proposed changes as per the independent review panel, or would you seek to do another thing?
That's not a bad question, given the nasty surprises after 2009.
I'd like to. We're stuck with what we've got. The line in the sand has passed when we've got Ergon and Energex, etc., etc. With John, it'd be lovely to wind back the clock to a very simple public owned model like CCLEB was, and was efficient, and was reliable, was cheap compared to what we've got now, and doesn't have that overlay of management versus executive management versus this management that we're all paying for with our electricity bills. To wind it back now, boy, I think it's going to be way too hard. To stop it going any further, I think we have to. I think we just have to act. We have to act now. What do you think about winding it back, John?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, I don't buy this notion that progress is in one direction, always the wrong one. And that's, I mean, I think if you buy that, you should certainly be absolutely opposed to any change, because the line is, anything we do can never be reversed. I would say we've seen lots of clocks wound back in various forms.
How much would it cost to wind back to secret?
Well, in principle, I mean, it's in principle zero cost to convert a corporation back into a statutory authority. Only an Act of Parliament would do it. The only question is whether you regard, if you seriously believe that CQEP did a better job than Energex, then you should support legislation that turns Energex back into CQEP. It's only a matter of changing the status from owned by two government ministers to a board with a commercial objective to the previous thing. The big problem is that the national competition legislation passed by all governments in the 1990s would render that effectively illegal. So you need to have national government legislation to change that. But in terms of economic cost, there isn't any.
Thanks, John. Thanks, John. I'm interested in hearing Anne's thoughts on, I think someone used the phrase winding the clock back, or at least perhaps returning to a more statutory authority model as opposed to GOCs.
Talking federally, wouldn't it be nice if Labor and the Greens did something in the Senate for a bill in that did that? How clever would that be? We've got to change the paradigm that we're working with at the moment anyway, because the current model doesn't really encompass a huge swing to solar and alternative energy. And we've got the possibility of batteries that will take people totally offline within about 2 years, I'm told. We've got salt silos that can also create base load for massive solar. And I don't think anything in the current models of our present power companies really takes that into consideration. And they have failed us enormously as a community to do that. They pretend that if you do, or the LNP has anyway, if you take people off any kind of rebate and force them out there against the big wolves, that in some way will boost the value of the asset sales and it will all help us. All it does is screw us over. They've done nothing but screw us over. I really think that we could go back to something of the model of the statutory authority, but if you need to do it federally, we're the party that's going to help you, because we do have 10 senators. So, if we could get some sense out of the rest of them, that'd be nice too. But I just think we're going to have to look to the future on this one. And yes, I do think we can go back to it, and I do think we can stop the halt of stupidity.
Anne actually raises an interesting point there when she talks about particularly the power generators not being prepared for a new paradigm of renewable energy and so forth. At this stage, and I must confess, I'll make a disclaimer, my wife works in the power sector, CSG.
It's all right. I met so many of them door knocking, but they all agreed with us.
Oh, okay. But I'd be interested in Paul's views on, because one of the arguments in favour of privatisation, particularly for generating assets like CS Energy and Stanwell, is, look, these are dinosaur companies. In decades to come, if not sooner, their value is just going to evaporate. It's better to get them off the books now and let the private sector deal with the problems. Anything else to respond to that?
I think for the time we still need them. We can't do without them at the present time. And it's got a good point, but I agree with Anne about the renewables and standalone solar power and battery power for households. We have to be careful because that will cause a lot of problems, positive problems. But what will happen, you'll find the electricity price will rise so high that the cost of solar panels and batteries will be much cheaper.
It can't go any higher.
That's right. But the cost of solar panels and batteries will be comparatively cheaper. So more people will then go, well, bugger, I'm off the grid, I'll put in solar panels and batteries, I'll run my house on that. That means there's less people buying the power of electricity companies, which means they have to jack the price up even higher.
That's why we're paying more.
Well, that's right, and the price will be
So
jacked
the rich
up.
people can put it on the roof.
It'll be, well, there's a lot of, we're off, I disagree. Well, I've been walking through Stafford with a lot of battlers that got solar power on the roof just to save a few bob, and a lot of pensioners have got solar power to save a few bob.
There's a lot of people who live in units who can't have solar power.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, I'm housing commission.
Yeah, well, the thing is that if more and more people have standalone generators with solar panels and batteries, that means less people will be buying the power. Less people buying the power means the prices go up per individual household more, which means more people go on to solar and battery, which means the price goes up even more, and more people go on solar and battery, leave very few consumers left to buy very expensive power. And I think the power companies, with this coming along, with renewable energy coming along and being efficient, the power companies really have to worry. They have to worry they're going to push too many people off the grid.
I'm going to pass it to Anna.
Whoops. I look it over your noggin. I did a bit of research on solar, and it seems that it's middle to lower class people, lower incomes who put it on because they are aware that prices are going up and they've been prepared to invest to stop that cost to them in the future. So in Queensland, the most take-up of solar is Harvey Bay, and it's not an up-and-coming mobile area, it's a lot of retirees who have seen the future. I hear what Anthony's saying, but I'm also talking about huge solar that the state could own, massive stuff. Nevada is just building one that will run Las Vegas. Imagine that, because they've got no bloody water to run it, I can tell you. That's all going to the streams over there, and so is all their food. But we could actually divest ourselves ultimately from coal-fired power stations, and we could own these alternatives. They could be solar thermal, they could be hot rods, they could be just from solar to salt. There is so many opportunities out there. The Chinese are leaping on them, so are the Japanese, although they still seem to have a bit of nuclear. But I think we've just got to wake up and see that there are so many opportunities. And we've got to get manufacturing back into this country. I am sick of having to sell bloody Chinese things in my business. I'm sick of it. I want Australia. Crane that doesn't bend in Gladstone Harbour, and then my bloody guy that does all my metalworks up there fixing it up for 6 months, and I've got no one doing my stuff. So I'm sick of it, frankly. I want to see it back here. You need power to help it, and cheaper power will do it. And we could own that. We could own the concepts. I mean, how many of our bright ideas from New South Wales University, the really thin solar panels, well, that went to China, unfortunately, and the base loading went to California, the wind work went to Denmark. We have not captured anything. Based on how it's no research and development money for 10 years, we just don't encourage anything in this country. And I go back to that fund that we set up, 10 billion, that Abbott's trying to dismantle at the moment. It is the way that you seed fund these great ideas. It's what you do in concert with the governments, and we could own all that power, and we could make bloody money out of it and be smart for once.
Lucky to point so much extra money to the CSIRO then, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
From the floor, please. Sir.
Yeah, my name's John Polton. Just on that sustainable and renewable, I think I've got a power station background. I'm sort of not in the industry now. I keep in contact with people, but I've been told by a CS Energy operator that the generating authorities now have to allow for a base load of about 1,000 megawatts from solar every day, because if the sun's shining and things like that. And what I'm seeing is that the Treasurer said that CS Energy would be the first one to go if they get in. CS Energy own Widener Pump Storage, Cogan Creek, and the I think it's Callide Sea, pretty much the two most thermally efficient power stations. What I'm seeing here is that with the feed-in tariff dropping off to virtually nothing, I think realestate.com is saying that 700 homes are being sold every month that have got solar on. To go from the 44 cent tariff back down to the 8 or nothing. So what I'm seeing here is that these potential companies who want to buy these things, they'll see Ivanhoe as a virtually they can pump it up at any time during the day, say after the peak, and it won't cost them anything to pump it up. And then they've got 500 megawatts of power sitting there for 4 hours. So I smell a rat myself. John could probably expand on that a bit more, but
John, if you
renewable and sustainable, it's got it written all over it. Sure. We already own it.
We'll go right back to the beginning. I mean, obviously, these assets aren't worth, the generation isn't as profitable as it was. That's largely reflected in distribution. And I guess from the general fiscal point of view of the state, if we could find private buyers to take them off our hands at full cost, it might look like a good idea. But I think we ran through the last of those suckers with the Airport Link Tunnel and the Cross City Tunnel. I don't think there's any where that came from. And so obviously, it's not as though they can't read the Treasurer saying these assets are worthless and we should sell them. It's not as though they're not going to do their due diligence. So we are looking at assets which, because of the things people have mentioned, are worth considerably less than they might have been. What they actually made worth, and we saw this with the carbon price, is the potential to extract substantial compensation from the government for things like carbon prices, which will undoubtedly return. So I think selling them off, speaking for the Australian public as a whole, we're building a rod for our own back, as we saw with things like Hazel.
Into the floor again, please. Up the back there.
Yeah. I was just curious.
Sorry, name, sir?
My name's Jake. My sins I am into the Greens, but my question's not political. I remember someone who's a fair bit older than me telling me that back in the day, government used to have more.
Sorry, you're competing with a poker machine payout, I think.
I remember some friends of mine who were a bit older than me saying to me that back in the day, governments used to have more people in-house who, when there was a bridge or a large road that needed to be built, would actually have the skills to do it. And I see nowadays we're outsourcing all that to private companies. And so regardless of whether you have a private, even if it's publicly owned, you're still outsourcing the buildings. So the question is, what is the efficiency, intuitively I think it would be beneficial for us to have more staff that at the very least can manage these external contractors, and therefore the government or the public person will be taken for a ride. I'm just curious as to whether or not John would agree with that, and perhaps could expand upon some of the underlying economics.
Actually, that's a good question, and I think one of the great problems has been retaining the corporate knowledge, the managerial brain power to actually be able to administer major outsourcing, and I think Queensland Health found that out to its detriment when it outsourced its payroll. But I'll hand you over to John.
Yeah, well, I've done a lot of work on this topic again. I guess I am older than you, so I've been working on this topic for 20 odd years, and there undoubtedly are instances when outsourcing makes sense. You don't want to have the whole show inside your own business. All businesses outsource some things and provide others in-house. But there's no doubt that, well, I'll make 2 points about outsourcing. One is that we've seen a bunch of spectacular disasters, and Queensland Health was only the latest of them. The Commonwealth Government also trying to outsource IT ran into massive problems in the Howard area. The second point is that very frequently when we see outsourcing appearing profitable, the gains come either from reduced service quality or reduced wage contributions to workers. And so that looks good, especially if we adopt the kind of calculus that goes with corporatisation. The individual organisation's bottom line looks better. As a society, though, we don't gain so much. So again, I don't think you can draw a black and white line and say outsourcing is always good or always bad. In any organisation, there are things that belong inside and belong outside, but the enthusiasm for outsourcing that's gone along with privatisation, I think, taking the whole package as far as deliver the goods, even if some instances work well and some spectacularly bad.
Any thoughts from our candidates on outsourcing, or would you like to move to another question? Anthony?
Thank you. A lot of outsourcing, I agree with John entirely. A lot of the outsourcing we see now is based on pure ideological claptrap. Everything that is outsourced, everything that is run by private must be better. It's not. There are some wonderful publicly run institutions that are much better left in the public, like Queensland Health Payroll was. But I think the population as well has this mindset. They've been told and told and told again, privatisation is good, outsourcing is good, it's more efficient. It's about time most of us here stood up and said to the public, it is not the case. A lot of public institutions do it very, very well and should study public institutions.
I'd certainly go with the claptrap, but a lot of it's been also done by Labor, because when we go to the Brisbane City Council, how much of that has been outsourced during the period of Labor being in charge of council? You can go for really simple things like maintaining the gardens, privately outsourced. Building the driveways at the end of the road that crumbles within 10 weeks of it being installed, privately outsourced. And each year, a new contract is awarded, because the last one undercut himself so bad he couldn't possibly go any lower. But this little turkey does, and no one's worked out that that is just not going to do the job, is it? So I think an enormous amount of loss of apprenticeships, loss of jobs, a loss of experience from the absolute grassroots up to the management has been lost because of this ridiculous philosophy. Now I know the Libs have a DNA called privatisation, and there is not only no ideological thing, there is just a totally irrational attachment to the concept. I don't think Labor is as bad, but they certainly have gone for a lot of privatisation in my time here in Queensland, and I've been back home for 36 years. I'm not happy with it. I think the Greens do have a better idea, and I think we all need to stand together now and stop it, because it is not beneficial to our economy or the jobs in our economy.
Thanks, Anne. Look, I think, Simo, we're trying to wrap up at around the 7:30 mark, so we may have time for one or two more questions if there's any from the floor. And if not, I'll throw it to our candidates and Professor Quiggin for any closing statements. Anyone else from the floor?
Well, I'd like to ask something
Please.
of Anne, Maxine Silvestro. When did Labor outsource parks and gardens in Brisbane City Council?
Many years ago. Many years ago.
I challenge that, because I actually think it was done under LNP, not under Labor at all.
Unfortunately, my dressmaker's husband, this one, is one of the people who was outsourced, and that was done under Labor. He was removed.
What year was that?
It was probably about 6 or 7 years ago. I'm
well,
a little bit more than
6
that.
or 7 years ago.
That was actually Canada Union.
But certainly all of the curbing and guttering was outsourced under Labor.
Okay, well, we might agree to disagree on this one for the moment, and perhaps Anne, if you...
I'll hold you on that one.
Perhaps, Anne, if we could swap details and sort this one out, because I'm sure it'll be on the record somewhere. And on that note, actually, I might give you the opening closing statement, if that makes sense. Just a couple of minutes, Max.
Look, I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's not quite as cold when we were here for the nurses' forum a week ago. I think my teeth were chattering, I probably looked nervous, and I was absolutely cold and bone. But this has been lovely tonight. It's a subject that really is close to my heart. My dad, he's a wonderful Keynesian economist, said you must retain ownership of your private assets. The size of this, and he did move the Australian Army for 25 years, so part of that was from a military point of view. Protection of the nation is very important to own them, but also he believed philosophically that we do the best job, and I think everything that he taught me has been borne out in evidence from the work I've done reading tonight, and the work I've done for years and years pushing public transport, promoting private ownership, public ownership of these assets that they are making private now. I cannot encompass an Australia that is not owned by the people. I don't think you will ever get a better outcome financial or service than you do from the work we do. There is absolutely nothing wrong with our public servants at every level. And we are vilified, and I was a public servant for many years in Canberra prior to coming back. We are vilified for what we do, and I think we work bloody hard. I think we did a good outcome, and I think we have the best interests of our company at heart, and our company is the people of Queensland. And I'd like to say all of it remaining in our ownership. And please, Green's the way to do it. Thank you.
I'd just like to again thank you, Paul, and thank the ETU for organising this evening's another community forum. Anne and I, as I stated before, Anne and I even went to the LNP forum and fronted up for them. We did. We fronted up for them.
And I think they liked us better.
Yeah. But any forum our opponent gets a whiff that he might have someone against him, just always a no-show. Always a no-show. But look. I was really looking forward to coming here tonight because I could learn. I could learn from John, and I have. I've taken away much more tonight than I've given. And I've also learnt from the people I meet out in Stafford. I've learnt from every one of you guys when I stop and chat and talk about what your concerns are. And if someone stops learning, that's a sad, sad day. Now also, my career is based on evidence, cold, hard facts. That's why we do operations, that's why we prescribe medication, cold, hard facts. What this government is doing is based on ideological claptrap, absolute claptrap. I think the saddest day for our community will be 15 years' time, we're looking at our kids and our grandkids, and we let this government go loose, we'll sit back and say, oh my God, what have we done? Now is the day that we can make a stand and make sure we can look our grandkids in the eye and say, we have power still within our safe hands, within the hands of all of us. Thank you.
Just briefly, thanks very much for the opportunity to come, and I hope I've been able to answer some questions. You can Google me, and if you Google and search for any of these topics, privatisation, contracting out and so forth, you'll find stuff, and I'm also happy to answer questions by email. I guess there's some feeling of embattlement. I think I've studied the subject for, as I say, a very long time. And what I've seen is that public opinion on the issue of privatisation has gone from being relatively open-minded, because the previous system certainly wasn't perfect, there was plenty of promises that we were going to see much better, to being absolutely made up. And we saw that, I think, with the outcome of the last election, that despite incredibly expensive and totally mendacious campaign from the government trying to persuade us that privatisation was a good idea, we saw where they ended up almost entirely, in my view, on that issue. The public has experienced privatisation, and I think has drawn the correct inference that taken as a whole, it's not a good idea. And so I think we don't want to feel like an embattled minority here. Not everybody wants to turn out night time and hear what they already know told to them, but I think the great majority of people in Stafford and elsewhere agree with the sentiments that have been expressed here. Thank you.
I can promise you, truly awful coffee over there. And some biscuits and cakes and so forth. What I'd like to do is, first and foremost, thank you all for turning up tonight. As John said, it's a fairly cold Monday night, and it takes a fair bit of effort to come out. But I'd also like you to put your hands together for everyone on the panel for the effort. And